It's very nice to join you on day two. And for those of you that I didn't get to see yesterday, it's a pleasure to join you. You may know the Ethical Transparency Tool, or the ETT, by its prior working name, which was the Flag Sharing System, or FSS. This new name communicates that the Ethical Transparency Tool is really about organizations and people leading to create a norm of ethical transparency across the higher education and research ecosystem by making it easier for societies and institutions of higher education and other research organizations, including funders, to access findings of sexual, gender, and racial misconduct about a person wherever that misconduct occurs across all sectors of where people work and really affect climate. Next slide, please. The ETT will help to implement priority recommendations of the June 2018 NASEM report on sexual harassment of women in academic science, engineering, and medicine, and AAU's recently adopted harassment prevention principles. This tool is core to the consortium's gender and intersecting racial equity and inclusion mission. And it really has the potential to be among the consortium's and its members' greatest contributions to date to actively creating more inclusive fields for people of all genders and races. All organizations that join in this effort will benefit while also making it an important contribution. Since 2019, the consortium and Education Council have been working to develop ETT with an advisory working group of leaders. That has expanded over that period of time to include 4 societies, 5 Research One universities, and 3 of the large higher education research organizations. You can see those listed here on this slide. I am a member of this group, which really just advises on operational practicalities and stakeholder interests. Being a member of this group doesn't mean that our organizations have fully committed to the process working forward, although most of our organizations have articulated strong support for the goals of this work. We are extremely proud of the consortium's investment in this initiative and really grateful to the Ed Council for their design efforts. And I'll just say personal thanks to my fellow advisory group members for their invaluable time and wisdom. We're really excited about the progress that we've made thus far and really the point in time that we've arrived at to share this information with you all today. There are several pre-read links that were included in your convening participant materials. And they include the ETT's briefing packet that you can use as a record of today's presentation and for sharing with leaders and other stakeholders at your home organization. That packet includes 3 resources that we just want to make sure that you're aware of. First, there's a 1-page overview of the ETT's purpose and key design elements. Second, a 2-slide handout on how the ETT works. It has an additional 2 additional options for briefing others. There's a 1-page handout and a presentation deck, both with embedded briefing explanatory notes. Our Ed Council colleagues have done an incredible job, I think, of preparing those materials. As somebody who's at an association, having those and being able to speak about this tool with those explanatory notes are just really, really comprehensive and lovely. So thank you to all of you who worked so hard on those. The third resource included in your packet is our short summaries of ETT's benefits for its key stakeholders. Entities that register to use ETT, individuals, and the higher education and research ecosystem broadly. Today, Jamie is going to provide a deeper dive on ETT, and she and I will answer your questions. We're really excited to try to provide you with as much information as we can in the time that we have today. We are working towards a pilot with the precise timing to be determined, but it's realistically in view by the end of 2022 or early 2023. And today we're inviting your societies as well as institutions and other organizations to join the pilot as inaugural transparency leaders. That's the kind of kudos that the advisory group has talked about, labeling those organizations that choose to join us within the pilot. So Jamie is now going to share a much more in-depth briefing on the tool, and then we'll be glad to take your questions. Jamie?
Thanks so much, Travis. I'll start with 3 points on what ETT covers. First is that ETT eases access to findings of misconduct against a person, not allegations. Second is that ETT highlights sexual, gender, and racial misconduct, but it also covers professional, licensure, financial, and research misconduct to maximize its utility. And third is that ETT applies to faculty, researchers, staff, postdocs, residents, and other employees and honorees, but it does not apply to students. ETT is designed to achieve 3 main objectives. First is to advance a healthy work and learning climate for everyone by reducing unwittingly passing the harasser or others whose conduct was found to be unethical. This does not mean that once found responsible for misconduct, a person cannot learn and regain trust, but it does require transparency about findings of misconduct for well-informed and independent policy and decision-making around honors, privileges, employment, and key roles. Second is to support ethical treatment of everyone by making it easier for societies, institutions of higher education, and research organizations to obtain, and for any of those entities or other entities that have employed, honored, or appointed a person to disclose reliable basic facts about their findings with a person's consent and without creating shame lists, to reduce the whisper campaigns as well as the surprises that arise from a lack of transparency. And third is to minimize an entity's legal risk when disclosing misconduct findings, while at the same time eliminating the enterprise risk of not knowing about findings or not getting that information from the most reliable source, which is the entity that made or adopted the findings. 3 key design elements enable ETT to minimize legal and enterprise risk at the same time while also achieving efficiencies. First is that ETT is a basic fact-finding tool. It is not a uniform policy. It does not dictate or guide decisions on who is qualified or should be selected for any honor or position. Each organization that registers to use ETT retains its independence to make its own policies and decisions, including, for example, how it defines finding, what selection criteria it uses and how it assesses qualifications, when and for what honors, employment, or roles it uses ETT to request misconduct disclosures, whether and when it uses other transparency tools, how and when it gains an individual's perspective on a finding, and whether and what consequences result from the existence of a finding. Second is that ETT obtains a person's consent before a disclosure is given, and it automates the consent process for efficiency. Once given, the person's single consent has a 10-year life unless rescinded early or renewed, and it can be used throughout that 10-year period by any ETT registered entities to request disclosures as part of making independent decisions about honors, employment, or key roles. And the consent may also be used by any entities that made or adopted misconduct findings about a person, authorizing them to make disclosures whether or not these entities are also registered to use ETT. And third is that ETT never receives disclosures themselves. ETT automates disclosure requests on behalf of an ETT registered entity when it wants disclosures and initiates them through ETT. And with the registered entity's disclosure request, ETT provides disclosing entities with both the person's consent and an efficient check-the-box disclosure form to increase the likelihood that authorized disclosures will be made. Importantly, the disclosure form template is limited to the hard to dispute but useful facts that are actually on the form, and they're listed. The kinds of misconduct are listed here on the slide, and it minimizes labor for both a disclosing entity and a requesting entity, because the disclosing entity does not need to redact and produce, and the requesting entity does not need to review voluminous files when that's not necessary. When completed, the disclosure form discloses that there hasn't been a finding, if that's the case, or it discloses the existence and year of a finding and the type of misconduct involved. So the main types are on the right side, but you can't read it on the slide, but the little check the boxes are lots of different subcategories within those main buckets. The facts disclosed on an ETT disclosure form and a person's input about the finding can be sufficient to inform an ETT registered entity's independent decision in many situations, because after all, one entity cannot relitigate the findings of another entity and doesn't have access to victims or witnesses. While the ETT automates disclosure requests and provides a disclosure form template to make disclosures easier, more efficient, and more likely, the disclosures themselves are made directly from the person's affiliated entity that made or adopted the finding to the specific ETT registered entity that requested it. ETT itself never receives a completed disclosure form or any conduct records. So ETT does not, and indeed it cannot, broadcast findings to all ETT registered entities or create a shame list or any central repository of disclosures or conduct records. A disclosing entity retains sole custody of its conduct records. Also importantly, ETT and other transparency tools are and, not or, propositions. For example, self-disclosures are one way to gain an individual's perspective about a misconduct finding, which is important. And they can also fill gaps when an entity won't provide any facts, even with a consent. But a self-disclosure only reflects the person's characterization. And if a person is not forthright or has a very different perspective than what the entity that made the finding has, they may cause harm in a community before being found out. In fact, a problem may be revealed through an untruthful, may actually reveal an untruthful or incomplete self-disclosure. So self-disclosures are good policy, but they don't substitute for disclosures by the entity that made or adopted a finding of misconduct when you can get them. Of course, in some situations, an entity may want a consent for full file disclosure, but even with a consent, full files are hard to obtain and are often time-consuming to produce and review. ETT can help avoid full file production when not needed, and it can enable disclosures for a wider range of honors, employment, and roles if desired, because it should be easy to use. Even in jurisdictions where a full file review is required by law or an education system, those reviews might be limited to the presumptive single or short list of finalists who will already have been preliminarily identified, taking into account disclosures using ETT, which can also contribute to a more successful process. So let's walk through the ETT process so you can see how it works. In step one, institutions, societies, and other research organizations, including potentially research funders, register to use ETT and become registered entities, RE on the slide. Only registered entities can request and receive disclosures. They also help to build a database of individuals' consent forms. Any registered entities, societies, institutions, or others, when they are registered, may require an individual, IND on the form here, on the slide here, to complete a consent form on ETT as a condition to being considered for particular kinds of honors, privileges, employment, or roles as designated by the registered entity. Each entity decides when and for what kinds of roles it wants to use ETT. An ETT registered society that confers many privileges and honors may also opt to communicate its commitment to ethical transparency and annually invite its individual members to voluntarily and proactively complete an ETT consent form at any time, even when they're not being considered for an honor or roll if they haven't already done so. And while it may be that people who are not really concerned about misconduct will do that, it will help to create a norm of transparency across the ecosystem of education and research. Note, however, that ETT consent is not expected to be a condition of unelected general society membership. It's not that it's prohibited, but that is not an expectation here. A person only completes a consent form once. The first time any ETT registered entity either requires a consent as a condition to considering the person for an honor, employment, or role, or receives a consent from someone who is volunteering to provide it. In step 2, an individual who is being considered by an ETT registered entity or volunteers to provide a form registers and completes a consent form on ETT if they haven't previously done so. And a single consent form has a 10-year life, but can be rescinded or renewed. Once given, the consent form authorizes all of the individual's professionally affiliated entities, past, present, and future, which we call affiliates, to disclose misconduct findings that they make or adopt about the person to any registered entity that makes a request via ETT throughout the consent's 10-year life. These affiliates are generally referenced on the consent form as employers, societies, and other honorary organizations and appointing entities. So in step 3, a registered entity, a particular registered entity that is considering an individual for an honor, employment, privilege, or role, and wants to use ETT to request disclosures as part of its own process, also requires the individual to provide a list of their affiliates. This kind of information is normally gathered even if ETT weren't involved, but ETT automates the process. The registered entity gives the individual a link to a private page on the ETT database, which only that person can access, and where the person completes their ETT exhibit forms. A full form lists all of the individual's affiliates, prior or current, at that time, with a contact for each. The look-back period for prior affiliates is the period specified by the particular registered entity that requests the exhibit form, and that can reflect that entity's own policy. One single entity exhibit form is also provided for each affiliate, listing only that one affiliate. Exhibit forms pair with the consent forms to confirm the identities of an individual's consent recipients that are authorized to make disclosures. An individual completes new exhibit forms with an up-to-date affiliate listing and contacts each time the individual is considered by any registered entity that wants to use ETT to request disclosure. So in step 4, when an individual submits their exhibit forms on ETT, that directs the tool to transmit the exhibits, and ETT automatically sends a PDF of the full exhibit form to the registered entity that is considering the person. And that registered entity then has 60 days to easily initiate disclosure requests to all of the individuals' listed affiliates by just clicking on ETT. If not timely initiated, ETT deletes all the exhibit forms. ETT is only a conduit for exhibit forms. We are not going to be a record repository, and that avoids bringing the process into certain unnecessary regulatory requirements. In step 5, if the registered entity timely initiates disclosure requests, ETT on behalf of the registered entity separately sends an automated request for disclosure to each affiliate, copying the registered entity and accompanied by a PDF of the individual's consent form, a single entity exhibit form listing only the affiliate that is receiving it, so we are not broadcasting to any one affiliate the identities of the other affiliates, and a blank ETT disclosure form. ETT also sends 2 automated reminders in the 21 days after the initial request is sent to assure effective delivery of the request for responses. ETT then deletes all the exhibit forms in connection with that transaction, and that marks the end of ETT's use in the registered entity's process on that occasion. In step 6, however, the ETT registered entity that requested disclosures and the person's affiliates continue their engagement outside of ETT. Using the disclosure form that ETT has provided, Each affiliate checks the box and inserts the year for any covered kind of misconduct finding that it made or adopted against the individual, or checks no finding or will not be responding if that's the case. Each affiliate chooses its own secure method for directly sharing the completed disclosure form only with the registered entity that requested it. For example, by screen sharing using a password-protected PDF or a password-protected website. And then in the final step, the registered entity regains the registered entity gains the individual's input as in whatever way it chooses according to its own policy. For example, a person's perspective could be elicited in a self-disclosure form or in a conversation. And applying all the facts that the registered entity determines to be relevant, the registered entity independently makes its decision under its own criteria and policy. So,
Well done, Jamie. So Ed Council is in the process of reaching out to societies, institutions of higher education, and research and education organizations, including some funders, to invite participation into the pilot, which is still to be scheduled. Participants will have an opportunity to try out the ETT tool and to provide input for final refinement, really to maximize ETT's usefulness. We are not asking for consortium members or friends to firmly commit today to participating in the pilot, but we do hope that many of you will complete a survey at the end of this session and express what we hope will be serious interest in joining the pilot. Understanding that we won't launch the pilot until we have assembled a sufficient group of societies and institutions of higher ed to make trying out the ETT worthwhile. Truly, the value of this is greater participation. The more entities that are involved, the more useful the tool becomes. Ed Council will also offer 2 follow-up web-based Q&A sessions. One will be on Wednesday, September 28th from 3 to 4:30 p.m. Eastern Time. The second will be Thursday, October 6th from 3 to 4:30 p.m. Eastern Time. Hopefully a time that will be convenient in all US time zones, and we'll provide these dates and times in the chat for you as well. As mentioned, pilot participants will have an opportunity to provide input into the final refinement. So this is a great opportunity for your voice and your organization's perspectives to be heard. And you will be recognized as inaugural transparency leaders. Your membership in this consortium made development of the ETT possible, and your participation will benefit your societies and really the entire higher education and research ecosystem. So with that, let's take some questions. What questions do you have about the design, the function, the pilot? I'm keeping an eye, but the chat is not open, right? So
I think Taylor just sent me a couple here.
oh, perfect.
So there's
the Q&A.
There's a question that came in. Can an entity like NSF or NIH be a requesting entity and ask for a form for anyone receiving an award? Maybe for any usual grant, maybe just for high profile ones like NSF PCASE award. And I guess we are open to having funders become registered entities here. We're not going to name names today, but we have some funders that are exploring a potential participation in this, and so that is a possibility.
Right.
Another question is, let's see, is there going to be an additional cost associated with joining ETT? I think that certainly for the consortium members have contributed to the development of this along the way. So I think there will be what we expect to be not a high cost, but some cost associated with institutions and organizations joining the ETT. Boston University has, which is on our advisory group, has developed a very detailed requirements document for our database. And before we can launch, we need to actually build the database based on those requirements. But they have confirmed our initial assessment, which is that in database terms, this is a simple database, not a high volume database. So we do not expect that to take a very long time. And hopefully it won't be a very big cost accordingly. And so I think we have to, the more organizations that join, the lower the cost will be for anybody who joins. And we hope to keep either nominal or no cost for consortium members, at least in the beginning, since you have supported this along the way.
And while we're mentioning, so Jamie just mentioned I would just offer our thanks to BU's IT group, who has kind of volunteered their expertise and time in helping us build out those specs. We would also like to thank the Luce Foundation, who has provided some funding support for outreach around the ETT, as well as Vanderbilt University, who has provided expert communication guidance for our briefing package. Both of those, all three of those organizations have provided support to us as we continue to refine the tool.